Boston's gearing up for a historic election to choose its mayor and city councilors this year. But there's also an effort to build on last year's expansion of voter access to make this year's election even more inclusive. That would be done through a home rule petition. That is two of them filed by our guest. We'd like to welcome the district city councilor from Hyde Park and Rosendale, Ricardo Arroyo. Thank you very much for being with us, councilor.
Thank you for having me.
Councilor, I know people looking back might think, at least through the big picture, that last year's turnout was pretty inclusive. Were there limits on that? And how much more inclusive can we make it in Boston?
So I think one of the things that people probably think about in terms of voting during the pandemic in 2020 for the presidential is how much easier that probably was for most people than it has been in the past, because you could do a mail-in ballot. You could do early ballot voting where you show up and you put it in a ballot box ahead of time or at City Hall. And those are things that were specifically created for the pandemic in the sense that those aren't the rules on any other regular election. In fact, the legislation that allowed for mail-in voting has only been extended to June, which is not helpful for us because there are no elections in June. And so there's a push right now to make that sort of emergency legislation that allowed for mail-in voting and mail-in ballots for the presidential to push that to December. What my home rule petition is seeking to do is to take the exact same thing that we just did, the mail-in voting, the same format and same way that we did that for municipal elections forevermore, because I think it worked. It increased participation. It's something that should happen. We know we have the ability to do it. We know that it increases vote totals. We know that it makes it easier for people to vote. There's no good reason not to do it.
Well, I know it's pretty popular in Boston. You like it. I like it personally. I use it myself. But on the other hand, one thing that Mass Vote noticed was that mail-in voting seems to work best with people who have a fixed address. They don't move very often, but not as well with some other people.
And that's true. And so one of the things that this home rule petition seeks to do, it's two separate home rule petitions. One of them is to expand our voting rights through mail-in voting permanently for municipal elections. But the other one should address that issue, which is creating, currently there's a deadline for registering to vote in the city of Boston. So in other words, you could be a resident of the city, you can live here, you could show up on election day, but if you didn't register to vote, I think it's like 18 days or 2 months or whatever that deadline is. I think it's 18 days, but don't quote me on that. It's a specific amount of time in front of the election. If you don't do that, even if you're here, even if you live here, even if you pay taxes, even if you're a legal citizen, they don't allow you to vote in municipal elections. We want to do same-day registration, which would allow you to show up to a polling place the day of the election. And as long as you live here, as long as you're a resident, as long as you're able to do all the paperwork, you can register to vote and your vote will count that day.
Well, I know this has been done in some other places. We're not inventing a wheel here, but it does seem that with same-day registration, there are some requirements for voters maybe to bring something to show who they are or where they live, and maybe for the city to process that.
Yeah, and so the process here is same-day registration has two different meanings. There's two different, so when you want what we want, which is early voting, so I would like voters to be able to, say, vote the weekend before an election or vote specifically when they're able to do it, because what we know is people who have jobs, I can't tell you how many times I've had folks call me, even in my own election, and say, hey, I'm working a double. I can't actually vote on election day, but I wish you the best. And what happens is people who work in that way work these sort of jobs that require them to be in person, who don't have the ability to get away to go to a specific polling place. Early voting is a godsend because it allows them to have their voices heard in their local elections on their schedule. And that's really helpful. And it opens up participation and it doesn't cost us anything extra. The thing we do to protect that when it comes to same-day registration is we have to make sure that you're a resident of the city on the day of election. And if we allow for same-day registration just on the day of the election, the primary date and the final in November, what that allows the election department to do is essentially set aside any new registration, confirm that all of those ballots are legitimate, and then count them, rather than having to seal all of early voting or any of the ballots that come in early voting. So you can't same-day register at an early ballot box, for instance, but you can same-day register on a day where we have poll workers and they're able to take those things and put them aside and make sure that we're going through that. And this mirrors and has the support of the Secretary of State, who had done a lot of work with the election departments across the state of Massachusetts and whose lead we are following on a lot of these things, because we understand that our election departments there's a feasibility to them actually being able to get these things done. And we firmly believe that everything that we're asking for here, they've demonstrated they can get done, and that we can do it in a way that is both safe for our democracy in the sense that the ballots are protected, the ballots are correct, but also safe for democracy in the sense that they create healthier democracies. They create more access and easier ways into voting and into having voices heard. And I think as somebody who's in elected office and who wants to get things done, I will tell you that elected officials, the saying is that we usually like these low turnout races. I will tell you that the more that people vote, the more participation there is. If you really want to see progressive changes or changes of any kind in politics, the way that we get that is through the ballot, through mandates from voters. And the more participation we have from the voting public on issues and having their voice heard, the more of a mandate you have to make things happen politically. And I think that a healthy democracy creates healthy societies because it creates healthy government.
I want to turn to another topic you've worked on quite a bit for reforming, and that's the Boston Police Department. And before we get into some of the individual measures, this also involved a process where the police department was supposed to be at the table to help improve the outcome all around, get closer to consensus. There have been some problems with that. What's your take on it?
I think that, like many folks, I've been a little bit frustrated with the pace of reform and change, and also what to me does not seem like a robust appetite for those reforms. And what I would say about that specifically is we're still going ahead with this. And what I said at one of these hearings, because I think what you're noting is that we've had several hearings regarding different aspects of reform, different bills and ordinances that we passed where BPD has not been present. They literally have not shown up even after being invited to hearings to speak. And what I've said is their lack of participation will not prevent these reforms from happening. So it's a question of, do I think that it would be better if we had their participation, if they had the buy-in that I think is appropriate for these kinds of reforms that really just aim at creating sort of an accountability and a transparency to the system? Yes, I think that's better for everybody. But if they don't come to the table, I'm not going to stop doing my job. None of the councilors are going to stop doing theirs. The mayor's not going to stop doing hers. And so these reforms are coming whether they try to stop them or not. And I think that's the part where, I've been in public meetings, public hearings. We've heard over and over again that there's real issues with Patrick Rose, with what we're seeing now play out with, I guess, still currently Commissioner Dennis White, what we've seen with Sergeant McHale, what were on those videos that The Intercept put out about the protests on May 29th. These are the kinds of issues that we've heard on an internal level. I mean, we have internal affair complaints. Part of the OPAT, the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency, was that we had internal affairs complaints that haven't been closed and they've been open for over a decade. That's unacceptable. And so we've had that feedback from people. We've had that feedback from residents. And I think the truth is most of these reforms, if you ever stop and just sit with them, talk through them, they're all common sense reform. I don't think anybody would say that anything that we're doing is particularly radical. And so I think that's just the direction we're headed.
One of the few common denominators maybe between Patrick Rose and Dennis White was questions about the ability of the police department to effectively and fairly investigate one of its own. Will the current reforms that are being put into place pretty soon address that, or do we need something more?
So it's going to have to be through the police contract that they do with the city. The collective bargaining agreement that comes through the city is going to have to address some of this, because one of the issues, even now as I speak to you, that we have is that the police union contract and statute essentially makes it so that the police commissioner is the only one who can dictate punishment. And then there's issues within the contract that deal with how somebody can be fired and let go. And so often what happens is people who have been fired on the police force find their way back onto the force, and often with back pay. And so it's become a very hard, problematic situation when mostly what it takes to get fired as an officer requires like almost criminal behavior, right? And so we're seeing what some would call criminal behavior in the sense of Patrick Rose. That's certainly criminal behavior. In the sense of McHale, I think they pursued or thought about bringing charges. It's the sergeant who's on desk duty who was accused of, while on duty, taking an intoxicated woman home and in a car, in a police cruiser, having a sexual relationship with her, which she said was rape. They did not bring those charges, and he admitted to, in an internal report similar to the way that there was an internal review for Patrick Rose, similar to the way there was an internal review for Dennis White. He admitted that he had an improper sexual relationship in a vehicle during while on duty, and that only got him a year suspension. And I think now he's currently also the sergeant who is in question for that video of saying during May 29th that he was hitting people with his cruiser, right? And so these are folks that shouldn't be on the force. These are issues that require us to really look and deeply investigate what we're doing to remove people from the force who have shown that they should not have that kind of power. The Office of Police Accountability and Transparency will certainly go into internal repair reports, will look at these different things, and will be public facing in that way. But ultimately, the decision, and this is clear because it's by contract, because it's by statute, as to what that discipline looks like is going to be dictated by that police contract. And so I think part of what is helpful in the Rose case becoming public is that people are much more aware that there's some hindrance to making sure that officers who don't deserve to serve are not allowed to serve. And that's often too in the weeds. That's in the fine print. That's too deep for somebody who's casually looking at this to understand. I think what Rose did is make clear that there's people who are serving. There are people who have served for decades. I mean, he became the president of the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association, who are in high levels who don't deserve to wear the uniform, don't deserve to wear the badge.
I also want to ask you about the crowd control measures that were adopted by the city after being stopped by Mayor Walsh a few months earlier. There were problems after the protest last year with some crowd control issues, property damage, and maybe some safety problems as well. But you also had problems with how the police responded with their crowd control, the chemical and kinetic weapons they used. Why does that need to change?
So one of the issues with this, which I think if you stop and think about it for a second, so when we talk about rubber bullets or sponge rounds, which are about this big and they're actually rubber and they're not made of sponge, or tear gas or chemical weapons that are actually banned by the Geneva Convention and war, these are indiscriminate weapons. That's what they are. They're not targeted weapons. They affect entire crowds. They affect areas. And when you think about how that impacts others, you don't have to go very far. Victoria Snellgrove, after the Red Sox, was not the target of that rubber bullet that took her life. And so when we talk about deadly force, which is what this is, it's called less lethal, but it still has lethal in the name because it can kill you. Tear gas canisters have hit people and killed people. Rubber bullets, we know, can do that. When we're talking about things of that nature and we're talking about firing them indiscriminately as a crowd control measure, I think it's only just and fair that if we're going to allow it, which I have personally said that I'm for a ban, but we're not there as a city, and so that's not what this does. It doesn't permanently ban it. What it does is it creates mandates for required warnings to give folks 4 minutes to disperse, so that if, say, Mr. Lovett is at a protest or a rally and somehow it takes a turn, that you have a chance to leave, that you're not just indiscriminately have tear gas and rubber bullets fired upon you, that you have time to leave this scene. And frankly, that if that behavior that leads to that warning stops, that they no longer activate or use things that can take a life. Because what we're talking about is, what are the requirements for using lethal force? If I were going to require, the 8 can't wait process, which I think was imperfect, but included things like, if you're going to fire a firearm at somebody, you have to make the warning verbal and you have to say that you're going to do it. And BPD, I think, said that would work for them, that they had no issue with that. This is the same thing with something else that can take a life. If a rubber bullet could kill somebody, and it has, then it only makes sense that before you fire that into a crowd, you issue a warning and you give people time to disperse. And one of the things that we made sure was clear is that only the highest levels of BPD, you have to be a deputy superintendent, can authorize the use of this, because this is something that can take a life. And so we're just trying to make sure that we're codifying the kind of language that creates protection for folks on the ground. It doesn't eliminate their ability to use these things. It simply creates a safer situation for residents and constituents who are there, who want to disperse or want to end that behavior peacefully.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Good to see you again. Boston City Councilor Ricardo Arroyo. We'll have more news in just a moment.